The third time they towed my truck, I was standing barefoot in my driveway holding a coffee mug that still had steam coming off it, just staring at the empty curb like maybe I'd parked somewhere else and forgot. Which sounds ridiculous now, but your brain does weird things when somebody keeps taking your property and acting like they're doing you a favor. What finally got me wasn't even the money. Though the tow fees were brutal, it was the note they left taped to my mailbox that morning. Repeated violations will result in further enforcement. Like I was some kind of criminal because I drove a plumbing truck home after work. That was the moment I stopped thinking of the HOA as annoying retirees with too much free time and started realizing these people genuinely believe they owned everyone around them. I moved into Maple Glen Estates about 6 years ago, just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Quiet neighborhood, mostly middle-aged couples, a few younger families, lots of golden retrievers and golf carts, and people waving from porches like they were auditioning for a medication commercial. Honestly, after my divorce, it felt safe. Predictable. I needed that at the time. I'd spent 20 years building my plumbing business from nothing, and by the time my ex-wife left, most days I just wanted peace and enough quiet to hear myself think. The truck was part of the business. White Ford F-250, company magnets on the doors, ladder rack on top, a couple dents on the bumper from job sites over the years. Nothing crazy. It wasn't leaking oil, wasn't abandoned, wasn't blocking anybody's driveway. Fully registered, insured, inspected. I parked it directly in front of my own house every night because my garage was full of tools and inventory. Apparently, that offended somebody's sense of suburban purity. The first complaint came from a woman named Linda Caraway, who lived across the street and somehow always appeared outside exactly when I got home from work. Didn't matter if it was 6 in the evening or 10 at night. She'd materialize holding a wine glass like an HOA ghost. One night, she actually smiled at me and said, "You know, this neighborhood used to look much nicer before all the commercial vehicles started showing up." Commercial vehicles. Plural. Mine was the only one. I laughed it off at first. Well, unless your sink explodes at midnight, you probably want one of these trucks nearby. She didn't laugh. Just gave me that tight little smile rich people do when they've already decided what they think of you. A few weeks later, I got a warning letter from the HOA. Said work vehicles damaged property values and violated community aesthetics. Community aesthetics. I swear people in HOAs talk like Disney villains. I actually pulled out the bylaws and read the whole thing at my kitchen table that night. There was nothing in there specifically banning work trucks on public streets. Nothing, so I ignored it. Then one Monday morning, the truck disappeared. I thought it got stolen. Seriously, I walked the block twice before calling the police, and the dispatcher sounded almost bored when she told me it had been towed by request of the homeowners association. Cost me $290 to get it back, and the guy at the tow yard looked embarrassed handing me the paperwork. "You live in Maple Glen?" he asked. Unfortunately, he shook his head a little. "Yeah, they call a lot." That stuck with me. I drove home angry, but still trying to be reasonable. I even called the city zoning office myself just to double-check everything. The woman there confirmed the street parking was completely legal. No city ordinance against commercial vehicles overnight. So I figured maybe the HOA made a mistake. Maybe somebody overstepped, and once I clarified things, it'd stop. 3 days later, they towed it again. That second tow hit different, not just because of the money. Though another $300 disappearing right before payroll definitely hurt, but because it happened overnight before an emergency water heater replacement job. I lost the contract because I couldn't get to the customer in time. Longtime client, too. Sweet older couple named the Bennett's. They ended up hiring somebody else while I was standing in a tow yard at 6:30 in the morning arguing with a guy named Rick who kept shrugging and saying, "Look, man, we just tow what they tell us." That night I went to my first HOA meeting, and that's where I met Gerald Whitmore. Gerald was one of those retired corporate guys who still dressed like he had quarterly meetings to dominate. Perfect silver hair, tucked polo shirt, expensive watch he made sure stayed visible whenever he crossed his arms. He sat at the front of the clubhouse like a small-town king pretending to be humble. I brought printed city ordinances, highlighted sections, photos, everything. I wasn't rude. I wasn't yelling. I genuinely thought this was going to be a simple misunderstanding. Then Gerald leaned back in his chair, smiled at me like a teacher explaining something to a slow student, and said, "Mr. Mercer, Maple Glen is a private residential community. Our authority supersedes municipal preferences." Municipal preferences. I remember just blinking at him for a second. Then I asked, "Okay, if it's private property, who owns the street?" And for the first time all night, Gerald stopped smiling. The room went weirdly quiet after I asked that question. Not dramatic movie quiet either. More like the kind where people suddenly become very interested in their coffee cups because they know something awkward just walked into the room. Gerald adjusted his watch, cleared his throat, then gave me this little politician smile and said, "The association manages all shared community infrastructure." That wasn't what I asked. "So the HOA owns it?" "We maintain it." "Yeah, but who owns it?" "One of the board members." This nervous guy named Elliot, who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 years, jumped in real quick with, "This discussion is becoming unproductive," which basically answered my question better than words could have. I left that meeting irritated, but also curious now, because the thing about people drunk on authority is eventually they stop noticing the cracks in their own story. Gerald acted like a man who'd been unquestioned for so long he forgot somebody could actually verify what he was saying. 2 weeks later, my truck got towed again. That was the one that changed everything. It happened during a thunderstorm around 2 in the morning. I know because the security camera caught the whole thing, flashing amber lights reflecting off wet pavement while my truck got hauled away like it was evidence in a crime scene. I barely slept that night because my dog, Murphy, kept barking at the noise outside. Then at 5:30 in the morning, my phone rang. Customer with a busted pipe flooding his basement, and I had no truck. I ended up borrowing my buddy Nate's van just to make the job. But by the time I got there, half the basement was underwater and the customer was furious. I knocked a few hundred off the invoice because honestly I felt guilty, even though none of it was technically my fault. Driving home that afternoon, exhausted and soaked from crawling around somebody else's basement all morning, I remember thinking something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I mean, sure, anger was still there somewhere underneath, but what I mostly felt was focused, like something had clicked into place. Because normal people don't keep towing the same guy's truck 3 separate times after being shown proof it's legal. That's not enforcement anymore. That's personal. And when something becomes personal, people make mistakes. So instead of finding them emotionally, I started treating the whole thing like a plumbing problem. Somewhere underneath all the walls and concrete, there had to be a pipe feeding this entire situation. I just needed to find it. The next morning, I took a day off work and went downtown to the Buncombe County Records Office. Now, if you've never spent hours digging through old property records, let me tell you, it is profoundly depressing. Fluorescent lighting, dusty file cabinets, exhausted clerks who look spiritually defeated. But there was this older woman working there named Diane who saw me flipping through subdivision maps like a lost tourist and finally asked what I was looking for. I explained the HOA situation. She actually laughed. Not politely either. Full genuine laugh. "Oh honey," she said. "HOA people always think they own more than they do." Then she helped me pull the original development filings for Maple Glen Estates, and that's where things got interesting. Turns out the roads inside the neighborhood were never officially transferred to the city. The original developer, a company called Blue Ridge Horizon Community, had gone bankrupt halfway through Phase 2 of construction almost 15 years earlier. According to the paperwork, the streets were supposed to be deeded over after final inspection, but the process was never completed, meaning technically, the roads were still privately owned, just not by the HOA. I remember sitting there staring at the paperwork while Diane sipped coffee beside me. "So who owns them now?" I asked. She tapped one page with her fingernail. "Looks like the assets got absorbed during bankruptcy restructuring." Absorbed by who? She gave me this grin like she already knew where my brain was headed. "Now that," she said, "is where your story gets fun." 3 days later, I was on the phone with an investment holding company in Charlotte called Ridgemont Asset Recovery Group. And let me tell you something about companies that buy abandoned infrastructure and forgotten property rights. They do not care emotionally about anything. To them, a road is just a line item sitting in a portfolio somewhere collecting dust. The guy I spoke with sounded half asleep the entire conversation. "You want to buy a residential access road?" he asked. "Potentially. Why?" I looked out my kitchen window at Gerald, walking his little terrier across the street like he personally founded civilization and said, "Call it a neighborhood improvement project." The guy laughed. "Well, technically you can make an offer." So I did, and honestly, even then I didn't fully know what I was doing. Part of me just wanted leverage, proof the HOA couldn't bully people whenever they felt like it. But another part of me, the stubborn part that got me through divorce court and 12-hour plumbing shifts and 20 years of building a business with my own hands, that part wanted to see how far this thing actually went. The negotiations took almost 2 months. During that time, the HOA kept sending violation notices. Gerald started patrolling the neighborhood in his golf cart like Batman if Batman's superpower was passive aggression. Every time he drove past my house, he'd slow down just enough to make sure I noticed him noticing the truck. One afternoon, he actually stopped at my curb. "You know," he said through this fake smile, "there are communities better suited for tradesman lifestyles." Tradesman lifestyles. I leaned against the truck and said, "Funny thing about tradesmen, Gerald, when your toilet explodes on Christmas Eve, suddenly we become essential workers again." His smile disappeared for exactly 1 second. Tiny moment, but I saw it. That guy didn't just dislike my truck. He disliked what it represented. Working class people, messy people, people who fixed things instead of attending wine tastings and committee meetings. And honestly, once I realized that, the whole neighborhood started looking different to me. Not everybody agreed with him. A lot of neighbors were perfectly decent. The Bennetts from down the street brought me cookies after hearing about the towing. A single mom named Carla offered to let me park in her driveway. Even Elliot, the nervous board member, avoided eye contact every time we crossed paths because deep down he knew the whole thing was wrong. But nobody challenged Gerald publicly, because people like Gerald survive on one thing above all else: the assumption that nobody's willing to push back far enough. Then one rainy Thursday afternoon, I got an overnight envelope delivered to my front porch. Inside was a deed transfer agreement. I read it 3 times before it fully landed in my brain. For the price of a used fishing boat and 6 weeks of legal paperwork, I now owned every inch of road running through Maple Glen Estates. And suddenly, the whole neighborhood got very, very interesting. The first thing I did after buying the road was absolutely nothing. Seriously, no announcement, no dramatic Facebook post, no marching into the HOA clubhouse waving paperwork around like some courtroom movie. I just signed the documents, put the deed in my desk drawer, and went back to work like normal. Because the truth is, power gets a lot more interesting when the other side doesn't realize you have it yet. 3 days later, my truck disappeared again. I almost laughed when I walked outside and saw the empty curb. Not angry laugh either. More like the kind you let out when the universe sets up a punchline too perfectly. I drove down to the tow yard at Nate's van, and the guy behind the counter recognized me immediately. "Man, again." He slid the paperwork over with this apologetic look on his face. Same authorization signature as before. Gerald Whitmore. I paid the fee, folded the receipt, and politely asked for copies of every towing authorization tied to my address over the last 6 months. The guy hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Honestly, I think you should have these." That night I sent a certified letter to every HOA board member. Inside was a copy of the property deed, the towing records, and a short note that simply read, "As the legal owner of Maple Glen Private Roadway Infrastructure, I do not authorize the removal of my vehicle from my property." My phone rang maybe 2 hours later. "Gerald." I answered on speaker while making a sandwich. His voice sounded different now, less polished, less certain. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "Doesn't seem like it. The roadway is considered community access property. Community property still belongs to somebody." "Gerald." Long pause. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What exactly do you want?" And honestly, at that point, I would have settled for a simple apology. Refund the tow fees. Admit they overreached. Maybe stop treating blue-collar workers like visual pollution. But people like Gerald almost never de-escalate gracefully because apologizing feels too much like losing. So instead, they doubled down. 2 mornings later, I got another violation notice taped to my mailbox. Unauthorized commercial vehicle. That was when I stopped trying to be reasonable. The signs went up that weekend. Pirabat Radi. Authorized v edicles only. Unauthorized parking subject towing. I installed one at each entrance to Maple Glen. Legally compliant. Proper reflective lettering. Everything done by the book. Then I mailed parking authorization tags to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Every homeowner except the 7 HOA board members who approved the towing requests. That part, yeah, maybe it was petty. But after months of being treated like I didn't belong there, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel a little satisfying. The first person to test me was Elliot, the nervous board member. I almost felt bad for him because I genuinely think he got pressured into supporting Gerald most of the time. But rules are rules, right? He parked overnight outside his own house. At 6 the next morning, his Lexus was gone. Word spread through Maple Glen faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, neighbors were standing in little driveway circles, gossiping like it was the season finale of a reality show. Some people thought it was hilarious. Some thought I'd completely lost my mind. Gerald apparently went door to door telling people I was holding the neighborhood hostage, which, okay, maybe from a certain angle, it looked that way. Then, Carla, the single mom from down the street, knocked on my door carrying a six-pack of beer and laughing so hard she could barely talk. "Please tell me you really towed Elliot's car." "I did." She wiped tears from her eyes. "That man once threatened to fine me because my Halloween decorations stayed up until November 3rd. That was the thing nobody talks about with HOAs. The rules are rarely about rules. They're about control, about certain people deciding their preferences should become everyone else's obligations. And once enough resentment builds up underneath that system, all it takes is one crack before everybody starts saying what they actually think." The emergency HOA meeting happened 4 days later. Packed room. Tension so thick you could taste it. Gerald stood at the front sweating through his collar while homeowners argued over each other. Some blamed me, others blamed the board. One older veteran named Frank literally stood up and shouted, "The man owns the damn road." "Gerald, what exactly did you think was going to happen?" I stayed quiet for most of it. Then finally Gerald looked at me and said, through clenched teeth, "What are your terms?" "Not demands. Terms." Whole different energy now. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a breakdown of every tow fee, lost wages from missed job sites, legal expenses, document filing costs, plus fair market value for the roadway transfer. Dead silence while they looked through it. One board member muttered, "This is insane." I remember leaning back in my chair and saying, "So was towing somebody's work truck 4 times because you didn't like looking at it?" Nobody had a response to that. Negotiations lasted nearly 3 weeks. Eventually, the HOA agreed to buy the roads collectively, then immediately transfer ownership to the city so nobody could weaponize them again, including me. Honestly, I respected that part. It was probably the smartest decision anyone made through the entire mess. The towing fees were reimbursed. Formal apology issued. New board elected. And Gerald, he resigned before the final vote even happened. Last I heard, he moved to Florida. Funny enough, once all the drama settled down, the neighborhood actually became better. People talked more. The HOA stopped acting like a dictatorship disguised as landscaping enforcement. Kids started leaving bikes on sidewalks without somebody measuring violations with a ruler. And my truck? Still parked right out front. Nobody's touched it since. Now, do I think I went too far? Honestly, sometimes maybe a little. Buying an entire road out of spite probably isn't the healthiest emotional response a grown man can have. But at the same time, there's something deeply satisfying about reminding arrogant people that power only works when everyone agrees to pretend it's legitimate. So I'm curious what you think. Was I justified? Or did I become just as bad as the people I was fighting? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because trust me, this neighborhood still debates it to this day. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare yourself, subscribe, because apparently suburban America is a lot more unhinged than people realize.